Imagine a world, verdant and vibrant, where kingdoms stretched across continents, their glory etched into stone and song. Their people lived lives of plenty, their future seemingly limitless. They built monuments to eternity, unaware that eternity could be so fleeting. Then the whispers began. A chill in the air unlike any before. A sun that turned shy, its warmth stolen by an unseen hand. This is not a tale of fire and fury, but of ice and silence. One winter, relentless and cruel, descended upon them, not as a season but as a judgment. It gripped their lands, their cities, their very breath. And when it finally receded, nothing remained but the frozen echoes of forgotten empires, swallowed whole by the snow. This is the story of those lost worlds. To truly grasp the magnitude of what vanished, you must first walk among the living. You must feel the warmth of their sun on your face, hear the joyous clamor of their cities, and witness the boundless generosity of their earth. Before the world fractured, before the breath of winter became a permanent shroud, existence itself was a celebration. Picture, if you will, the sprawling lands of Ethelgard. Not merely a kingdom, but a tapestry woven from human ingenuity and natural splendor. Its cities rose like titans from fertile plains, their spires kissing the clouds, not with arrogance, but with a profound, almost humble ambition. Ethelgard was a beacon of knowledge, its libraries vast repositories of wisdom carved into vellum and illuminated manuscript. Scholars, their minds alight with curiosity, debated philosophies under grand, vaulted ceilings, their voices echoing with the pursuit of truth. The laughter of children chasing doves in sun-drenched courtyards, the gentle hum of artisans' workshops where masterpieces were born from raw stone and molten metal, these were the daily symphonies of Ethelgard. Their people lived lives rich with purpose, believing their foundations were eternal, their prosperity a divine right. The very air thrummed with a vibrant energy, a collective pulse of creation and contentment. Then there were the verdant plains of Xylos, a kingdom defined by its profound connection to the land. Here, the soil was a living entity, tended with reverence by generations of farmers. Imagine endless fields stretching to the horizon, a sea of golden wheat swaying in a breeze heavy with the scent of harvest. Their harvests were legendary, not just for their abundance, but for the communal joy they brought. Festivals burst forth with color and sound, celebrating the earth's bounty, the turning of the seasons, the tireless efforts of their people. Their homes, built from the very earth they tilled, were open and welcoming, filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and the warmth of kinship. The Xylosi lived simple, honest lives, their wisdom gleaned not from dusty scrolls, but from the rhythms of nature, from the cycles of planting and reaping. They knew the stars as their guides, the rivers as their veins, and the sun as the very heart of their existence. Their strength lay in their unity, their unwavering belief in the endless generosity of the world around them. Across the shimmering azure, beyond the reach of the plains, lay the sunstone shores of Lyra. A confederation of island nations and coastal cities, Lyra was a realm of dazzling beauty and maritime prowess. Its harbors teemed with ships, their sails emblazoned with vibrant symbols, returning from distant voyages laden with exotic spices, rare silks, and unheard-of stories. The Lyran people were master mariners and traders, their livelihoods bound to the ebb and flow of the tides. Their cities, carved into cliffsides or built upon coral reefs, shimmered with a unique luminescence, reflecting the sun's light from countless polished shells and crystals. Their culture was a vibrant mosaic of song, dance, and intricate craftsmanship. Jewelers honed gems to breathtaking perfection, weavers created tapestries that told epic sagas, and bards sang tales of ancient sea spirits and daring explorers. Life on the sunstone shores was a melody, carried on the salt-laced wind, a testament to freedom and adventure, to a people who saw the vast open ocean not as a barrier, but as an invitation. And nestled deep within the ancient, sprawling forests, hidden from the casual eye, was the enigmatic Deepwood Empire of Eldoria. This was a place where trees touched the sky, their branches interwoven to form living cathedrals, where sunlight filtered through leaves like scattered jewels. The Eldorians lived in harmony with the ancient woods, their cities seamlessly integrated into the towering groves. They possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of the natural world, a kinship with every rustling leaf and murmuring stream. Their wisdom was ancient, passed down through generations of lore-keepers, guardians of forgotten knowledge and subtle magics woven into the fabric of their existence. They were a people of quiet strength and profound patience, their lives unfolding in sync with the slow, deliberate pulse of the forest. Though less outwardly boisterous than their counterparts, their influence stretched far, their counsel sought by many, their serene confidence a source of stability in a world brimming with diverse energies. These kingdoms and countless others flourished under a benevolent sun, their people living in an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. There was trade not just of goods but of ideas, of cultures, weaving a complex, interconnected web across continents. Merchants traversed ancient roads and navigated well-charted seas, bringing new wonders to every market. Diplomats forged alliances, ensuring long periods of calm, allowing innovation to thrive. The air was filled with the promise of tomorrow, the certainty that each new day would bring further progress, deeper understanding, more profound joy. They built not merely for their present, but for a boundless future they confidently envisioned. Their architects designed structures meant to defy the ages. Their engineers harnessed rivers and wind, their artistry elevating every functional necessity into a thing of beauty. Their healers developed remedies derived from the earth and stars, prolonging life and easing suffering. The notion of scarcity was a distant memory, replaced by an abundance that allowed for the flourishing of arts, sciences, and the profound pursuit of happiness. To them, the seasons were a reliable, gentle cycle, the warmth of summer following the awakening of spring, the rich bounty of autumn preceding the brief, crisp slumber of winter. Each was a chapter in a predictable, comforting story. They celebrated the longest day, danced under the harvest moon, and gathered around hearths during the mildest of winters, never imagining that the very rhythm of their world could falter, could betray them. They were a people in love with life, secure in their grandeur, their hearts beating with the steady rhythm of a world that seemed to be in perfect, perpetual bloom. They gazed at their horizons not with fear or apprehension, but with an unwavering belief in their own permanence, their own endless unfolding. They could not have known that their vibrant symphony of life was soon to be silenced, their grand narrative brought to an abrupt, unforgiving close, not by war or plague, but by the relentless, quiet hand of a single, catastrophic winter. Their world, so rich and full, stood on the precipice of an unimaginable descent, utterly unaware of the frozen judgment awaiting them. The first touch of what was to come was not a roar, but a whisper, barely perceptible against the familiar melodies of a fading autumn. It was a subtle shift in the very breath of the world, a faint dissonance in the grand symphony of their predictable seasons. The wind, usually a playful companion ushering in the crispness of late harvest, began to carry a new edge. It was a sharpness that cut deeper than the typical autumnal chill, a metallic tang that bit at exposed skin and burrowed into the soul. Farmers, whose hands knew the earth with an intimacy deeper than words, were the first to feel it, a cold that seemed to rise from the very soil, a creeping numbness defying the calendar. Their crops, usually resilient, showed pockets of inexplicable blight, withered and brown long before their time, a silent warning whispered by the dying leaves. Then came the sky's silent betrayal. The sun, once a generous golden orb, seemed to recede, its light turning pale and watery, a distant, uninterested eye in a firmament that slowly, inexorably, deepened to a somber gray. The days shortened with an unnatural haste, as if an unseen hand was pulling back the cloak of light, revealing more of the vast, indifferent darkness. Twilight stretched into agonizing eternities, bleeding into nights that grew colder, deeper, and profoundly silent. The creatures of the wild, those instinctual interpreters of nature's subtlest signs, displayed a growing agitation. Flocks of migratory birds, usually a predictable stream heading south, became confused. Some lingered, circling their ancestral homes with a frantic, bewildered energy, their calls sharp with an unarticulated distress. Others departed with a sudden, desperate urgency, leaving behind an unsettling void, a silence that felt heavier than the usual absence of song. Forest animals, typically engaged in their methodical preparations for winter sleep, now forested with a desperate, unending hunger, their small eyes wide with a wild, knowing fear that spoke of a coming scarcity far beyond the ordinary. And then the wind. It was no longer a whisper, but a steady, insistent groan from the distant, untamed north. It swept down from the jagged, snow-capped peaks, a malevolent current that seeped not just into bone, but into the very spirit of the land. It carried a cold that was alien, a pervasive chill that promised more than a mere harsh winter. It was the breath of something ancient and unforgiving, a primal force stirring from a long slumber. Initially, the people of the kingdoms dismissed these disquieting anomalies. An early frost, they would murmur, drawing their cloaks tighter, seeking reassurance in the familiar warmth of their hearths. A particularly brisk autumn, they would rationalize, pouring another goblet of mulled wine, clinging to the comforting rituals that had always defined their lives. They sought to fit these disturbing deviations into the known patterns, to impose order on a world subtly beginning to unravel. But the comfort felt thin, a fragile shield against an encroaching, nameless dread. Yet, a deep-seated unease began to take root, a collective prickle of apprehension that defied rational explanation. The elders, those keepers of generational lore and seasonal wisdom, felt it first. They spoke of tales from their grandmothers, stories of winters so profound they were whispered with a shiver. But even those ancient warnings did not quite match the unsettling current now coursing through the land. This was different. This felt malignant. The trees themselves seemed to recoil from the encroaching cold. Their leaves, usually a vibrant riot of gold, russet, and crimson, turned brittle and fell with an unnatural haste, not swept away by the wind's playful dance, but dropping as if in sudden, collective surrender. The ancient forests, once places of solace and bounty, now stood rigid and dark, their skeletal branches rattling like dry bones in the ceaseless, biting wind, their silence holding a deeper, more profound message. The rivers, usually boisterous and lively, began to run sluggish, their surfaces frequently glazed with a thin, premature sheet of ice that defied the very notion of late autumn. The water flowed with a reluctance, its usual song muted to a mournful gurgle beneath the growing frosty veneer. The ground itself, usually yielding and fertile, was hardening with an alarming speed, resisting the plow, becoming an unforgiving canvas for the coming desolation. The whispers began to grow louder, not in spoken words of panic, not yet, but in unspoken questions, in stolen glances, in the subtle tightening of shoulders around market stalls and by hearth fires. A growing sense of things being profoundly, irreparably wrong permeated the air. What was usually a methodical process of winter preparations, the stockpiling of food, the mending of roofs, the sharpening of axes, took on a new, urgent dimension. What was once tradition became a race against an invisible clock, a scramble born of an instinctual, unarticulated fear that whispered of a hunger that could not be sated, a cold that could not be escaped. Even the very light of the heavens offered a chilling spectacle. The aurora borealis, usually a rare and celebrated marvel in the northernmost reaches of their world, began to dance with a new, unsettling intensity. Its vibrant tendrils bled across the heavens in hues of emerald green and searing violet, a cosmic warning painted in light. But who among them could read such an apocalyptic script? Who could decipher the language of the sky's desperate plea? This was not the gentle sigh of autumn deepening into winter. This was a prelude, a low, sustained hum beneath the surface of the world, growing louder, more insistent with each passing day. It was the sound of a vast, indifferent force beginning its slow, inexorable descent, a grand overture to destruction. The world itself was beginning to shudder, to groan beneath the weight of an approaching cataclysm. And the people, so accustomed to harmony, could only interpret these tremors as an unusually harsh, yet ultimately fleeting deviation from the norm. They sought warmth in their roaring fires, but the flames seemed to draw back, their heat less potent, less comforting against the invading, pervasive cold that seeped through stone and wood alike. They sought solace in stories, in the familiar sagas of heroes and hearts, but the tales seemed to falter, their magic muted by the raw, biting reality that pressed in from beyond their walls. The frost that painted the morning grass refused to melt through the afternoon, a ghostly white shroud clinging stubbornly to the land, a persistent, chilling reminder that the sun's power was waning, its dominion challenged by a colder, more relentless master. The air itself grew dense, heavy with an unspoken expectation, a profound stillness that settled over the land, muffling the usual sounds of life, replacing them with the mournful keen of the wind and the subtle, ominous creaks of a world under duress. The omens were everywhere for those who truly saw. Not portents written in distant stars or ancient prophecies, but etched into the very fabric of their daily lives. In the frenzied behavior of the birds, in the reluctant surrender of the leaves, in the unforgiving, persistent bite of the air. These were the harbingers, the scouts of an ice age not of millennia, but of a single devastating winter. A winter that would erase kingdoms, silence entire civilizations, and leave nothing but the mournful echo of a forgotten age, carried on the very northern wind that had first whispered its terrible arrival. Then it began. Not with a cataclysmic roar, nor a sudden violent tearing of the heavens, but with a subtle, insidious betrayal of the very source of life. The sun, once a blazing titan, the unyielding heart of their world, began to dim. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, as if a thin ethereal veil had been drawn across its face, muting its golden brilliance. Each day the light seemed a little weaker, a little colder, like a memory fading into the mist. The warmth it usually bestowed upon the earth, that life-giving embrace, became a scarce, precious commodity, a phantom limb of comfort that was no longer there. People stared at the sky, their faces etched with a dawning dread, their eyes tracking the sun's shrinking arc. It was no longer the vibrant orb that marked the passage of seasons, but a pale, distant presence, a reluctant lantern hung too far away. The morning light grew hesitant, stretching its faint fingers across the land with a weary reluctance, and the evenings descended with an unnatural swiftness, plunging the world into a deeper, more profound darkness than ever before. The vibrant tapestry of the sky, once painted with hues of dawn and dusk, now surrendered to a monotonous palette of muted grays and steel blues, as if the world itself was holding its breath. This was not simply a longer winter, not merely a harsh season. This was a fundamental shift, a cosmic shrug that signaled the end of an era. The sun, the mighty giver of light and life, was turning shy. It retreated behind an impenetrable curtain of atmospheric phenomena, or perhaps, its very essence was being siphoned away, leaving the kingdoms below to gasp in a perpetual twilight. The days shortened dramatically, not by minutes but by hours, until the demarcation between day and night blurred into a continuous, oppressive gloom. The world existed in a state of endless dawn, or perhaps an eternal dusk, trapped in an ambiguous interval where true light never fully broke through. Panic, initially a low hum beneath the surface of daily life, began to surge. Farmers watched their hardy winter crops, already stunted by the early cold, wither and die beneath the starved light. The cycles of nature, once dependable as the beating of one's own heart, were thrown into disarray. Animals, confused and disoriented, either fled to parts unknown or succumbed to the deepening cold and gloom. The air itself seemed to thicken with unspoken fears, a palpable anxiety that pressed down on every village, every city, every soul. What began as an inconvenience, a challenge, quickly escalated into a profound terror. Without the sun's full strength, the cold intensified its siege. The relentless wind, once merely a harbinger, became a cruel tormentor, slicing through the thickest cloaks and finding its way to the very marrow of one's bones. Ice formed where it had never dared to before, creeping across rivers, cementing lakes into unyielding expanses, and frosting the very breath from one's lips. Houses, once sanctuaries, became increasingly difficult to heat, their hearts roaring with ravenous hunger for wood, yet offering only a fleeting respite against the ever-encroaching chill. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine living in a world perpetually cloaked in twilight. Colors, once vivid and reassuring, faded into a somber monochrome. The vibrant reds of berries, the lush greens of pines, the deep blues of distant mountains, all bled into a muted canvas, mirroring the despair that began to grip the human heart. Shadows, long and distorted, danced at the periphery of vision, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. People found themselves whispering instead of speaking, their voices hushed by the oppressive quiet, as if afraid to disturb the profound stillness of the dying light. Sleep became a fractured, restless thing, the absence of true night making it difficult to distinguish rest from wakefulness. The natural rhythm of existence, ingrained in every living creature, was brutally disrupted. Children, usually brimming with life and laughter, grew quiet, their eyes wide with an ancient understanding of the impending doom. Their games became somber, their songs mournful echoes of a forgotten time when the sun shone bright and warm. Leaders, once secure in their thrones, faced an enemy they could not fight with armies or treaties. This was an assault from the cosmos, a betrayal by the fundamental forces of their world. Council halls, once filled with the clamor of political debate, now resounded with desperate pleas and futile suggestions. Wizards and seers, revered for their foresight, found their prophecies dissolving into incomprehensible riddles, their magic faltering in the face of this unprecedented desolation. The very fabric of their understanding of the universe was unraveling before their eyes. Trade routes, the lifeblood of kingdoms, froze over not just with ice but with fear. Merchants dared not venture into the endless twilight, where visibility was poor, and the threat of starvation drove both man and beast to acts of desperation. Supply chains fractured, leaving remote villages isolated, their meager stores dwindling with terrifying speed. The rich found their wealth worthless, for gold could not buy sunlight, nor could silver melt the perpetual ice. The poor, already teetering on the brink, were pushed into an abyss of hunger and despair, their pleas for help swallowed by the vast, indifferent gloom. You would see it in their eyes, the desperate glimmer that slowly faded into resignation. The endless twilight was not just a physical phenomenon, it was an assault on hope itself. It stole the very essence of optimism, replacing it with a creeping dread, a certainty that something fundamental had broken and could never be fixed. The air tasted of ice and ash, a lingering reminder of the cold embrace that tightened its grip with each passing moment. The forests, once teeming with life, grew silent, their boughs heavy with ice, their branches gnarled and skeletal against the perpetually dim sky. The ground became an unforgiving, frozen expanse, rejecting any attempt to coax life from its barren depths. Rivers, once gushing with the vibrancy of spring and summer, now moved sluggishly beneath a growing skin of ice, their murmur a faint, dying whisper. The very soundscape of the world transformed, losing its natural chorus to the mournful sigh of the wind and the eerie creak of a world frozen in time. This was the quiet, agonizing beginning of the end. A winter like no other, not merely a season of snow and frost, but an epic of shadow and ice, unleashed by a sun that had turned shy. It was a creeping, insidious doom that stole the light, then the warmth, then the very will to survive. The kingdoms, built on centuries of sunlight and seasons, found their foundations crumbling, not from war or plague, but from the simple, terrifying absence of light. Their fate, once seemingly eternal, now hung by the thinnest thread, illuminated only by the faint, failing glow of a world that was slowly, inexorably forgetting the sun. The great, chilling silence had begun its work. The great, chilling silence had begun its work. Now its cold grip tightened not just on the land, but on the very breath in every living creature's lungs. The first true snow fell not as a gentle blanket, but as a shroud, thick and unyielding, arriving weeks, then months before its accustomed time. It was a premature burial for the burgeoning autumn harvests, a sudden, brutal declaration of war against the very source of life. The farmers, weathered and wise in the ways of the earth, watched in stunned disbelief as their fields, once golden with ripening grain or green with sturdy root crops, succumbed to an overnight onslaught of ice and frost. The wheat, still standing in defiant rows, became brittle monuments, each stalk encased in a deathly sheen. The barley, promised bounty of ale and bread, shattered under the sudden freeze, its delicate kernels rendered useless, black and hard as pebbles. Below the surface the earth, usually still pliable, froze to an iron hardness, trapping turnips, carrots and potatoes in an icy tomb. What could not be harvested was lost. What was harvested lay in sacks, wet and rotting or frozen solid, impossible to process. The first true tragedy was not starvation, but the complete annihilation of the promise of food. The granaries, those symbols of foresight and survival, once brimming with the golden wealth of summers past, became the only beacons of hope. But even their bounty, carefully measured and meticulously stored, was never designed to withstand an endless winter. These were stores for a season, perhaps two, never for an epoch. The first week saw a nervous consumption, a quiet assurance that this too would pass. Meals were smaller, perhaps, a loaf of bread divided among more, a stew stretched with more water than meat. But the illusion of plenty, however fragile, still held. Then came the true realization. The snow did not melt. The sun, a weak, pale orb, offered no warmth, no sign of thaw. Spring planting became a ghost of a dream. There would be no new crops. The stores within the granaries, once considered vast, began to shrink with terrifying speed. Each measure of grain scooped out, each barrel emptied, was a countdown, a tangible loss that clawed at the collective spirit. The herds, too, suffered a swift and brutal fate. Pastures, thick with summer's grass, were now sheets of treacherous ice or buried beneath feet of 5 feet of snow. Fodder, meticulously saved for the usual winter months, dwindled at an alarming rate, consumed by animals whose hunger never ceased. The cattle, once robust and sleek, grew gaunt, their ribs stark against their hides. Sheep huddled together, their wool matted with frost. Pigs, usually voracious, squealed with a desperate, unfamiliar whine. Disease, born of cold and malnutrition, swept through the pens. Their dying was a chilling prelude to what awaited their human masters. Every carcass, once a source of meat and hides, now represented a dwindling future, a loss that could not be replaced. The cries of the starving animals echoed the growing fear in human hearts. The slow, insidious creep of hunger began not with a sudden gnawing emptiness, but with subtle shifts. Portions became smaller, then smaller still. The taste of salt, once a common companion to meals, became a rare luxury. Watery gruel replaced hearty stews. Children, always the most vulnerable, were the first to show the signs. Their faces, once plump and rosy, grew thin, their eyes too large for their pallid cheeks. Their laughter, once the music of every home, faded into a quiet, resigned silence. Mothers, their own stomachs aching, would hide morsels for their little ones, offering their own lives for just one more breath from their fading children. Desperation became the new currency. What little food remained outside the communal stores became priceless. A handful of dried peas, a single shriveled apple, could fetch a king's ransom. Markets, once bustling with trade and chatter, grew silent, their stalls empty, save for a few desperate souls bartering heirlooms for a single meager loaf. The whispers of hoarding grew louder, spreading through the villages like a disease. Neighbors eyed neighbors with suspicion, the bonds of community fraying under the immense strain. Trust, once the bedrock of these close-knit societies, dissolved in the face of primal hunger. From the high towers of their castles, the kings and queens, once symbols of unshakable power, watched their kingdoms slowly starve. Their decrees, once absolute, now seemed hollow, impotent against the relentless assault of nature. They commanded their stewards to find food, to unlock more stores, to send scouts into the frozen wilderness, but there was nothing to find, nowhere to turn. The royal granaries, though richer than any peasants', were finite. The feasts that once defined their courts became somber, austere affairs, their rich dishes replaced by the same meager rations consumed by the common folk. The guilt, a heavy cloak, settled upon their shoulders, a silent acknowledgment of their failure to protect their people from an enemy they could not fight. The human body, remarkably resilient, fought a losing battle. First came the constant gnawing pain, a hollow ache that never truly left. Then the dizziness, the weakness that made every step a monumental effort. Hands trembled, limbs grew heavy, movements became slow and deliberate. The warmth of healthy blood receded, leaving extremities perpetually cold, prone to frostbite. Sickness, a cruel opportunist, preyed upon the weakened. Fevers raged, coughs tore through fragile lungs, and the simple cold became a death sentence. The grave-diggers, once busy only in times of plague or war, now toiled ceaselessly, their spades echoing the rhythm of a dying world. The quiet deaths began in the villages, then in the towns, creeping inevitably towards the cities. Not with the dramatic screams of battle, but with the soft sigh of a fading breath, a final weary surrender. Families huddled together, seeking warmth and comfort that could not compensate for the lack of sustenance. Parents watched their children's eyes dim, their small bodies wasting away. The excruciating choice to share the last meager portion or to save it for the strongest became a daily torment. The tears flowed freely, then dried up, replaced by a grim, numb acceptance. Hope, a fragile flame, flickered and died in countless hearts, extinguished by the relentless cold and the aching void in their bellies. This was not a war against an invading army, nor a battle against a visible disease. This was a silent, internal siege, waged against the very essence of life itself. The slow starvation was a weapon of unparalleled cruelty, stripping away not just flesh and blood but dignity, compassion, and finally, the will to live. It was dismantling the kingdoms from the inside out, turning vibrant communities into desolate landscapes of suffering, paving the way for a collapse far more profound than any conquest. The fabric of society, stretched thin by cold and hunger, began to unravel, thread by agonizing thread. The great, chilling silence that had settled upon the land was now echoed by the silence of empty stomachs and dying breaths, a prelude to the ultimate cessation of life in a world that had forgotten the sun. The world had forgotten the sun, and in its shadow the very idea of order began to perish. For generations, kingdoms had stood, built on the bedrock of laws, leadership, and the collective will of their people. They were monuments to human ambition, sustained by the tireless rhythm of agriculture, trade, and governance. Yet, as the great winter deepened and the cold became a constant, gnawing presence, these pillars began to crumble, not with the crash of a falling empire, but with the insidious whisper of decay. First, it was the crown itself that felt the tremor. Kings and queens, once symbols of divine right and absolute power, found their authority eroding with each passing day of starvation. Their grand decrees, once obeyed without question, now rang hollow in the frozen air. What was the value of a royal edict when the granaries were empty? What good was a declaration of war when the warriors themselves were too weak to stand, their bellies aching, their loyalty replaced by the primal urge for survival? The gilded halls of power, once bustling with courtiers and petitioners, grew silent, their tapestries gathering dust, their fires sputtering for lack of fuel. The lines of succession, the complex dances of diplomacy, the very mechanisms of statecraft, all dissolved into irrelevance. Ministers and advisors, once fiercely loyal, melted away like snow in a brief moment of warmth, each seeking to secure a meager scrap for their own dwindling families. The king, once a figure of awe, became a man, shivering and hungry, watching his realm starve. The queen, once a beacon of grace, became a mother, clutching her children, their small hands growing colder by the hour. Their tears, once hidden behind stoic masks of leadership, now flowed openly, futile and unheeded. Then came the unraveling of law, the very fabric that held communities together. In the first days of the winter, justice had been swift, sometimes brutal, but it had existed. Robbers were caught, disputes were mediated, and a semblance of order prevailed. But as hunger sharpened its teeth, the line between right and wrong blurred. Desperation became the only law. Theft, once a punishable offense, became a necessity, a desperate gamble for another day of life. One by one the jails emptied, not because of pardons, but because the guards themselves had abandoned their posts, or simply died of the cold. The concept of property, once sacred, evaporated in the face of absolute need. What was a boundary stone when your child cried for bread? What was a deed of ownership when the food it represented was gone? The very agents of order, the soldiers and watchmen, were not immune. Their uniforms, once symbols of authority, became rags. Their weapons, once instruments of protection, became tools of personal survival, used to defend a handful of scavenged roots or a stolen animal carcass. Discipline, once ironclad, fractured. Units broke apart, men deserting to search for their families, or simply to wander lost and aimless until the end. Some turned on the very people they were sworn to protect, their hunger twisting them into predators. The sight of a uniform, once a comfort, now brought only fear, a stark reminder that even those sworn to uphold the peace were now part of the brutal, unyielding chaos. Villages, once vibrant hubs of life, became isolated outposts of misery. The roads, once arteries of trade and communication, lay silent and choked with snow, impassable. Caravans ceased their journeys, their goods plundered or simply left to rot. The absence of movement, of communication, meant that each community was an island, left to its own devices, left to its own despair. Rumors, whispered like ghosts on the wind, spoke of entire towns simply gone, their inhabitants vanished, their houses silent and frozen monuments to what once was. Fear, a cold, creeping fog, settled over every hearth, turning neighbor against neighbor, community against community. The bonds of shared humanity, once strong enough to build empires, now strained under the weight of an impossible choice: share the last crumb or save your own. More often than not, the latter prevailed. This was the true horror, not just the physical suffering, but the tearing apart of the human spirit. Compassion, a virtue nurtured over centuries, withered and died. Empathy became a luxury no one could afford. The cries of a starving child from the house next door, once a call to action, now became merely another sound in the orchestra of suffering, a sound to be endured or ignored, lest it infect your own dwindling reserves of resolve. People stopped looking into each other's eyes, for fear of seeing their own reflection of agony, their own silent plea for help that could not be given. The hearth, that sacred center of family life, became the ultimate battleground. Within those four walls, the struggle was most acute, most agonizing. Parents, once providers and protectors, found themselves stripped bare of their ability to care for their own. You could feel it, the shift in their eyes, from love to a terrifying, desperate calculation. To choose which child would eat the last morsel, or to decide when to let go of a loved one whose weakened state drained precious, irreplaceable resources. These were the choices that broke spirits, shattered souls, and turned homes into tombs of the living. The laughter of children, once the sweetest sound, faded into whimpers, then into silence. The warmth of a shared meal, once a daily ritual, became a distant, fading memory, replaced by the gnawing emptiness of hunger. Families, once the unbreakable unit of society, began to unravel. Some clung fiercely to one another, finding their only solace in a shared misery, their only warmth in a dying embrace. Others fractured, driven apart by the unbearable pressure, by the need to survive at any cost. Children, once cherished, sometimes became burdens, small mouths demanding sustenance that simply did not exist. The elderly, once revered for their wisdom, sometimes became sacrifices, their bodies too frail to endure, their lives offered up silently for the sake of the younger, stronger ones. These were the unspeakable acts, born not of malice, but of the purest, most desperate love and the most profound despair. The very concept of a future ceased to exist. Why plant seeds when no sun would warm the earth? Why plan for tomorrow when today was an eternity of pain? Hope, that most resilient of human emotions, had finally been vanquished. There was no tomorrow, only an endless, frozen present. And with the death of the future came the death of purpose, of meaning. What was the point of living when life itself offered nothing but suffering? The kingdoms, in their final agonizing throes, did not fall in a blaze of glory or a roar of defiance. They simply faded, like a dying ember in a desolate grate. Their people, once vibrant and numerous, diminished with each passing day, their numbers dwindling until only scattered, isolated remnants remained. The grand pronouncements of rulers, the meticulously crafted laws, the complex tapestry of society, the comforting ritual of the hearth, all dissolved into the indifferent expanse of the winter. What was left was not a conquered land, nor a ruined city, but a void. A silence where laughter once echoed, a barren landscape where fields once swayed with grain. The stories of kings and queens, of heroes and villains, of triumphs and tragedies, all were swallowed by the snow, erased from the collective memory of a people who no longer existed to tell them. The kingdoms did not disappear in an instant, but slowly, agonizingly, piece by piece, from the highest crown to the smallest, dying ember in the hearth, until only the wind remained, whistling through empty halls, a desolate dirge for a world that had vanished with the sun. The wind, a desolate dirge, whispered through empty halls, a stark echo of a vanished world. But the absence of a people, the silence of a forgotten age, begs a deeper question. How does an entire civilization, a tapestry of lives and dreams, simply cease to be after a single winter? This was not the work of invading armies, nor the slow decay of centuries. This was an annihilation so swift, so complete, it defied human understanding for generations. Imagine, if you will, standing beneath a sky that has turned against you. Not with fire and brimstone, but with something far more insidious. An impenetrable veil drawn across the very face of the sun. The ancient chroniclers, if any had survived, might have spoken of a deity's fury, of cosmic retribution for forgotten sins. But modern science, with its relentless pursuit of truth, paints a different, perhaps even more terrifying picture. It speaks of a silent, invisible enemy that descended from the heavens, not in a storm of steel but in a shroud of ice. This was a cataclysm of unimaginable scale, born not from the conflicts of humankind, but from the raw, untamed power of the earth itself. Picture the land, serene and unsuspecting, suddenly convulsing. Deep within the planet's core, pressures build, tectonic plates grind, and a primordial rage seeks release. Somewhere, perhaps in a remote, uninhabited corner of the world, a mountain stirs. Not just a tremor, not a simple eruption, but an explosion that tears open the very crust of the earth. A sound, a concussive wave, that would have deafened any creature within 100 leagues, and sent vibrations echoing through the solid rock for thousands more. This was no ordinary volcano. This was a supervolcano, a geological beast awakening from a slumber of millennia. Imagine a column of ash, smoke and superheated rock, not merely rising into the sky, but punching through the troposphere, through the stratosphere, tearing a hole in the veil of the atmosphere itself. Billions of tons of pulverized rock, silica, and sulfur dioxide injected with unimaginable force, kilometers high, into the upper reaches of the planet's protective shell. From the ground, it would have been a spectacle of horrifying grandeur. A sun blotted out, not by a passing cloud, but by a permanent darkening plume that spread outwards, ever wider, ever denser. The air, thick with fine particulate matter, would have choked lungs, stung eyes, and brought an eerie twilight even at midday. For those who lived within sight of such an eruption, it would have been an apocalypse rendered in shades of black and gray, an incessant rain of ash burying everything beneath a desolate, gray powder. Homes, fields, forests, all entombed not by snow, but by the stony breath of a waking giant. But the true devastation was yet to unfold, a slow, creeping horror that knew no geographical bounds. The fine aerosols, rich in sulfur, did not simply fall back to Earth. Carried by high-altitude winds, they began their inexorable journey around the globe, forming a vast, reflective blanket high above the clouds. This wasn't merely dust. It was a sunshade meticulously crafted by nature's fury, designed to turn away the life-giving warmth of our star. And so the great dimming began. Day by day, week by week, the sun's benevolent rays grew weaker, filtered through an ever-thickening shroud. The sky, once a brilliant blue, became a muted canvas of gray and pale orange, an eternal twilight that cast a pall over the world. The warmth, the very essence of life on Earth, began to recede. Temperatures plummeted, not gradually, but with an alarming, unrelenting speed. You might wake one morning to find a frost that never truly melts. A thin sheet of ice on the puddles that persists throughout the day. Then the snows begin. Not the gentle, transient flakes of a typical winter, but an endless, heavy descent. Snow that falls and never ceases, blanketing the earth, smothering the last vestiges of green. The ground, once fertile, hardened into an iron-bound plain, impervious to plow or spade. The rivers, the arteries of civilization, froze solid, their lifeblood congealed into unyielding ice. Lakes, once teeming with fish, became vast, frozen mirrors, reflecting only the dim, distant gleam of a weakened sun. The sea itself, for those who lived near its shores, would have begun to show signs of its own rebellion, ice floes forming where none had been seen before, encroaching on the once navigable waters. This was the one winter the legends whispered of, a winter unlike any humanity had ever known. It was not a season that passed, but an epic of ice that descended with brutal finality. The plants, starved of sunlight, withered and died. Crops failed on a global scale. The careful agricultural calendars, honed over millennia, became meaningless. There was no harvest to reap, no grain to store. The very foundation of human survival, the ability to cultivate food, was utterly eradicated. Animals dependent on these ecosystems perished in droves. Herbivores starved as their food sources vanished beneath the snow and ice. Carnivores in turn found their prey diminished to nothing. The intricate web of life, so carefully balanced, unraveled with terrifying speed. For humankind, it was a sentence of starvation, a slow, agonizing descent into oblivion. Picture the faces of those who endured it. The bewildered expressions, the dawning horror as they realized this was not merely a harsh winter that would pass. The growing despair as the sun remained a pale, distant memory. The children, their laughter stolen by the encroaching cold, their futures frozen solid before their eyes. The elders, their wisdom rendered useless against a foe that defied all earthly knowledge. They would have huddled around dying fires, desperately burning anything they could find, furniture, books, the very timbers of their homes, to stave off the relentless chill. Each day a struggle against the encroaching darkness, each night a battle against the freezing air that seeped into every crack, every crevice. The warmth, once a comfort, became a precious, dwindling resource, guarded with fierce desperation. The social structures, the laws, the bonds that held communities together, would have frayed and snapped under such unbearable strain. Survival became the only law. Compassion a luxury few could afford. And then, one by one, the flickering embers of hope, of life, would have been extinguished. Centuries later, the Earth remembers. Deep within the ancient ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists extract cylindrical cores of frozen history. Each layer a year, a season, a whisper from the past. And in specific layers, telltale traces appear: elevated levels of sulfate aerosols, microscopic shards of volcanic glass, geochemical markers that scream of a cataclysmic eruption. These signatures, dating back to precise moments in time, correlate with other global markers: stunted growth rings in ancient trees from across continents, sudden shifts in pollen samples in lake beds, evidence of widespread famine and population collapse in archaeological digs. The sky's wrath was real. It was not myth, but geology and atmospheric physics converging in a perfect storm of devastation. A single event, a monumental eruption, was enough to shroud the world in a veil of winter, a scientific shroud of ice, from which entire kingdoms could not emerge. Their disappearance was not an act of divine judgment, but a stark, brutal testament to the Earth's own power, and the profound fragility of human civilization when faced with forces beyond its control or comprehension. The silent halls, the empty fields, the wind's desolate lament, they are not just remnants of a vanished past, but chilling warnings, echoing across the millennia, of the true power of the sky, and the thin, tenuous thread upon which all life depends. The great shroud descended, not as a sudden, cataclysmic blow, but as a slow, insidious stranglehold. You might imagine the first flakes, an unseasonable flurry, met with surprise, perhaps even a brief, passing wonder. A novelty. But then came more and more, a relentless descent from a sky turned a perpetual bruised gray. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and the world outside the familiar walls of your village, your city, your burgeoning kingdom, began to vanish under an ever-deepening blanket of ice. The first whispers of fear would have been dismissed as peasant superstition, or the ravings of madmen. But the fear grew, a gnawing cold deeper than the frost that crept into every home. The sun became a myth, a faint memory of warmth, a pale disk behind an endless veil of atmospheric debris. The crops, the very lifeblood of these lands, withered and died, entombed in an icy grasp. What meager harvests were stored, dwindled with terrifying speed, each grain, each root, a precious, finite symbol of a life that was slowly, inexorably being extinguished. Hope, once a flickering flame, began to gutter. Communication, once a vibrant lifeline of trade and diplomacy, dissolved utterly. The envoys stopped arriving. The merchant caravans, laden with goods and news from distant lands, simply ceased to appear over the horizon. Roads became impassable arteries, choked with snow and ice, then swallowed entirely by the desolate white. Each kingdom, each fledgling empire, each proud city, found itself an island in a vast, unforgiving sea of frozen despair. The silence that fell was not merely the absence of sound, but the horrifying absence of human connection, of news, of shared struggle. A silence pregnant with the unspoken dread of profound, absolute isolation. Imagine the king, once concerned with border skirmishes or the marriage of a daughter, now staring out at a world stripped bare, his power suddenly meaningless against a force that cared nothing for crowns or lineage. His people, once loyal subjects, now starving, shivering, desperate, their eyes reflecting the cold terror of a future that offered no dawn. The granaries, meticulously filled during years of plenty, were now being emptied with a heartbreaking swiftness. The promises of spring became cruel mockeries, whispered perhaps by the old, but met with only the blank stares of the young, who had known nothing but the unending winter. Within these isolated pockets, humanity faced its ultimate brutal test. The veneer of civilization, so painstakingly constructed over generations, began to crack, then shatter. Compassion warred with brutal self-preservation. The strong might try to protect the weak for a time, But eventually the cold, the hunger, the endless night, would wear down even the most resolute spirit. Laws and customs, once the bedrock of society, crumbled under the weight of sheer animalistic need. There were no longer allies beyond the walls, no distant empires to petition for aid, no vast armies to summon for rescue. There was only the bitter, biting wind, the relentless, unforgiving white, and the growing certainty that they were utterly, profoundly alone. The true tragedy was not in the immediate violent end, but in the slow, agonizing realization that they were marooned, utterly cut off. The maps that once showed vast networks of kingdoms, rivalries, and alliances, now depicted only blank, white spaces beyond their immediate, freezing horizon. Did they wonder about their neighbors? Did they send out desperate scouts, only to have them swallowed by the snow, never to return? Did they stare across the frozen wastes, imagining other fires that had long since been extinguished? We can only guess at the terrible weight of that loneliness, the crushing burden of knowing that the world they understood, the world of human connection, had simply vanished, leaving them stranded, waiting for an end they could not avert. The silence between kingdoms was not merely a quiet. It was the sound of a world dying. It was the sound of hope draining away, drop by agonizing drop, like blood from a wound in the deep snow. It was the unspoken understanding that no one was coming. No hero on a white horse, no benevolent empire with grain to spare. Just the wind, whistling its mournful dirge through empty streets, through the skeletal remains of forgotten forests, over the frozen bodies of those who had simply given up. Generations of knowledge, of craft, of art, of stories, extinguished with a quiet, desperate gasp. Libraries, once repositories of wisdom, were burned for the fleeting warmth they offered. Artisans, their hands too numb to work, watched their skills and their creations perish with them. The songs of their ancestors, once echoing through feasting halls, faded into the hungry silence, their melodies replaced by the guttural cries of despair. Children born into this endless winter would have known no other world, their brief lives a constant, grueling struggle against an omnipresent foe. Their laughter, their tears, their very existence swallowed by the vast, indifferent cold. These were not just cities or villages that disappeared. These were entire cultural universes. Unique languages, intricate social structures, spiritual beliefs forged over millennia, all lost to the relentless maw of winter. The very memory of who they were, what they valued, what they dreamed of, frozen and then shattered. Imagine the last scholar, huddled by a dwindling fire, trying to preserve the ancient texts, his fingers stiff, his eyes dimming. The last storyteller, his voice hoarse with hunger, trying to impart the sagas of a warmer time to children whose faces bore the grim mask of perpetual cold, their minds too numb to fully grasp the tales. Their efforts, valiant though they were, ultimately futile against such an overwhelming existential threat. The archaeological record, sparse and chilling, whispers of these lost worlds with a spectral voice. The sudden cessation of pottery styles as if the kilns had cooled forever. The abrupt halt in the construction of monumental structures, mid-build, frozen in time. The eerie lack of burials in once thriving cemeteries, suggesting not a sudden mass death, but a slow, agonizing decline that scattered the desperate, or perhaps a nomadic flight into the absolute unknown, where even death went unrecorded, lost to the snow. The abandoned settlements, frozen in time, offer haunting glimpses of a hasty departure. A sudden, final end to daily life. A half-eaten meal on a table, a tool dropped mid-work, a child's toy left by the hearth, a silent testament to lives interrupted, then extinguished. These are not relics of a grand conquest, but tragic echoes of a quiet desperation, a civilization simply giving up its ghost to the overwhelming cold. The silence that followed was absolute. No survivors to tell the tale, no written accounts to chronicle the final, terrible years. Only the earth itself, a silent witness, holding on to the frozen secrets of these vanished civilizations, preserving them in a cold, stark embrace. The wind, once carrying the chatter of markets and the clang of blacksmiths, now howled through ruins, carrying only the dust of crumbled dreams, the spectral sigh of countless lost souls. This was not a war where one kingdom fell to another. This was a war against existence itself, waged in isolation, fought without a shared enemy to rally against, without the hope of victory. Each kingdom faced its own private apocalypse, cut off from all others, its struggles unknown, its demise unmourned by any but its own dying inhabitants. The scale of the catastrophe was not just global in its reach, but profoundly personal in its devastating impact on every single soul caught in its grip. The human will, so often lauded for its resilience, found its match in the indifferent, relentless advance of an unnatural winter. The very concept of a kingdom presupposes a network, a relationship with other powers, whether friendly or hostile. But when the world itself turns against you, when the threads of communication and common experience are severed, what remains? Only an island, adrift in a vast, desolate sea of ice, its inhabitants slowly realizing that the beacon fires they once saw in the distance have all gone out. The faint smoke plumes on the horizon have vanished. The distant drums have fallen silent. The songs of trade and alliance have been replaced by the mournful shriek of the blizzard. And then their own light too dimmed. Not with a shout but with a whimper. Not with a final glorious stand, but with a quiet, inevitable fading of breath in the frigid air. The last spark of human warmth extinguished, one by one, until the only warmth remaining was the residual memory in the frozen earth, and the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of their forgotten names. The silence between kingdoms grew absolute, stretching across the vast, empty spaces where human voices once sang, argued, and prayed. A profound, terrifying void. A testament to the delicate balance upon which all human endeavor rests, and the unforgiving power of a planet scorned. We gaze upon these ghost lands now through the cold, stark lens of science, and hear the echo of that terrible silence, a warning that transcends time itself. A chilling reminder that even the mightiest empires are but fragile constructs, utterly dependent on the benevolent warmth of the sun and the steady pulse of a living world. Without it, even a single winter can erase them from the face of the earth, leaving behind only the chilling quiet of forgotten dreams, and the stark, white proof of humanity's ultimate vulnerability. That ultimate vulnerability, that chilling quiet, was not always accepted passively. Before the dreams were entirely forgotten, before the last breath solidified into icy mist, there came a primal, agonizing scream for survival. It was the desperate, universal impulse to flee, to seek another sun, another spring, another hope beyond the encroaching, unrelenting winter. When the walls of their world began to crack, when the very air they breathed turned into a weapon, millions across these doomed kingdoms made the impossible choice, to leave everything they knew behind and walk into the unknown. They called them the Exodus, or the Great Wandering, or simply the Flight. It was a mass movement on a scale rarely seen, born not of ambition or conquest, but of pure, unadulterated fear. Imagine it, entire cities emptying, their cobbled streets echoing with the hurried footsteps of thousands. Families, bound together by ropes and terror, trudging through snowdrifts that grew deeper by the hour. Children, their faces blue with cold, clutched tightly by parents whose own hands were numb, whose hearts were breaking with every step away from home. The elderly, carried on makeshift litters or simply left behind, their last gasps forming silent prayers in the frigid air. Each person carried a fragment of their former life, a precious heirloom, a handful of dried grain, the faint hope of sanctuary in a distant land. They whispered tales of a warmer valley, a southern plain untouched by this glacial curse, a kingdom that still knew the sun. These whispers became their mantra, their only fuel against the biting wind and the gnawing hunger. They walked for days, then weeks, then months, their bodies growing thinner, their spirits flickering like dying embers. The trails they forged were not pathways to new beginnings, but vast, desolate arteries of despair, stretching across a land already in the throes of a death rattle. The early days of the migration were perhaps the cruelest. There was still a semblance of order, a shared delusion of purpose. Leaders, once mighty in their palaces, now walked among their people, their authority stripped down to the raw power of persuasion, of hope. They promised refuge, they promised warmth, they promised a future. But with each sunrise that brought only more snow, with each evening that deepened the chill, their words grew hollow, their promises brittle. The migrating columns, once proud and determined, began to fray at the edges. Small groups peeled off, seeking their own impossible paths, or simply collapsing where they stood, too weary to continue the charade of forward motion. Food, once rationed, became non-existent. The land itself was frozen solid, offering no sustenance. Even the desperate hunt for wild game yielded nothing but the ghostly tracks of animals that had already succumbed to the cold or fled south themselves, instinct guiding them more reliably than any human map. They ate the bark from trees, boiled their leather straps, chewed on frozen roots, anything to quell the gnawing emptiness. But the cold, oh, the cold was the true adversary. It seeped into their bones, stole their breath, and dulled their minds. It was a silent predator, claiming its victims one by one, not with violence but with a slow, agonizing embrace. You can almost hear their ragged breaths, feel the phantom ache in your own limbs as you imagine their journey. You see the father sacrificing his last morsel for his child, the mother wrapping her cloak around her baby, knowing it meant her own death. You see the small acts of kindness, the final gestures of humanity in the face of such overwhelming inhumanity. And then you see the inevitable. The child's eyes clouding over. The mother's grip loosening. The father falling, his spirit finally broken. These migrations were not just about reaching a destination. They were a prolonged, public battle against oblivion, fought on every frozen mile. The cruelest revelation for these desperate travelers was not the depth of the snow, nor the ferocity of the wind, but the crushing realization that there was nowhere to go. Their tales of southern warmth, of sun-drenched plains, were just that, tales. The global winter spared no one, no region, no kingdom. They marched for weeks only to find the next valley just as frozen, the next city just as abandoned, the next horizon just as white and bleak. The trails they followed were indeed desperate, but they were also, tragically, migrations to nowhere. Every step forward was a step deeper into the same inescapable, freezing tomb. The last remnants of these great migrations would have dwindled to a handful of ghost-like figures, their faces etched with starvation and despair. They would have stumbled on, driven by a flicker of will so profound it defied all reason, until even that flicker was extinguished. Their bodies, frozen solid, would have become monuments to a futile hope, scattered across the desolate landscape like broken toys. Today, if you were to walk those ancient, silent paths, you might still find the faint outline of a forgotten campfire, the shard of a ceramic pot, a single child's frozen shoe. These are the scattered, poignant breadcrumbs of humanity's last, desperate gamble against a world that had turned its back. These weren't just the disappearances of kingdoms. These were the agonizing, drawn-out demises of millions of individual lives, their hopes slowly crushed under the relentless weight of an unyielding winter. Their trails, etched into the memory of the frozen earth, stand as a testament not only to their suffering but to the profound human courage that still sought life, even when all around them proclaimed death. They sought escape, they sought salvation. But in the end, the ultimate lesson of that long, terrible winter was that sometimes, in the face of a truly scorned planet, there is simply no escape. Only the chilling, final quiet. The ultimate lesson was the chilling, final quiet. But how does an empire, a sprawling network of cities and people, truly fade into such silence? It is not with the roar of invading armies or the fiery collapse of a capital city. Sometimes the end comes like a slow, insidious sickness, a quiet demise that creeps in on padded feet, cloaked in the white shroud of winter. These were the kingdoms that did not fall with a bang, but simply stopped, exhaling their last collective breath into the freezing air, leaving behind only the profound absence of sound. Imagine a city, once vibrant, now merely a collection of silent stones. The last baker stopped kneading dough not because of a riot but because the flour ran out and no more would arrive. The last merchant closed his stall, not because of a decree, but because there were no more goods to sell and no one left to buy them. It was a cessation, a slow, agonizing unraveling of all that holds a society together. The intricate web of trade, the pathways of communication, the very pulse of communal life, all became frozen, brittle, and eventually shattered. The silence began in the periphery. Small villages, already struggling, simply ceased to send their tributes or their messengers. Their lights went out, one by one, like distant stars extinguishing in a vast, dark sky. Then the larger towns felt the pinch. The winter roads became impassable not just because of snow, but because no one had the strength, the fuel, or the sheer will to clear them. Isolation, a quiet killer, descended like a heavy cloak, smothering hope and connection. What happens when the central authority, the very heart of an empire, loses its veins and arteries? Starves. The decrees from the capital went unheeded, not out of rebellion but out of sheer impossibility. Who would carry the message through a blizzard that swallowed horizons? Who would enforce a law when the entire populace was focused on the primal struggle for the next breath, the next morsel? The concept of empire, of governance, of even civilization itself, began to lose its meaning, melting away under the relentless onslaught of a world consumed by ice. The collapse was not recorded, for the scribes froze at their posts, their inkpots turned to solid stone, their parchment brittle as autumn leaves. There were no chroniclers left to tell the tale of the ultimate, quiet surrender. History itself became a casualty, wiped clean by the biting winds and the ceaseless drift of snow. All that remained were the whispers of the wind through empty streets, the creak of ice on forgotten roofs, and the distant howl of hungry wolves echoing through abandoned palaces. This was a different kind of tragedy. Not the grand, dramatic end of legend, but the quiet, creeping despair that makes a people lay down their tools, then their weapons and finally, their very will to live. You did not hear the screams of a dying empire, but the soft, almost inaudible sigh of its last, fading breath. The hearths grew cold, not suddenly but slowly as the wood ran out and the strength to forage for more evaporated. The last fires died, plunging entire cities into a darkness that even the stars seemed unwilling to pierce. Consider the human element in this quiet demise. Imagine a mother huddled with her children, their eyes wide with fear and cold, watching the last ember in the hearth fade to ash. There is no enemy to fight, no battle to win, only the creeping, relentless cold that seeps into their bones, stealing their warmth, then their hope and finally their very lives. This was the silent war, fought not with swords and shields, but with dwindling supplies and the relentless erosion of spirit. The fields, once green and bountiful, lay fallow under a permanent white blanket. No spring thaw came to signal renewal. The plows rusted, forgotten in their barns. The cattle, already thin, collapsed in their stalls. The granaries, if they hadn't already been emptied in desperate, last-ditch efforts, stood frozen, their contents rotting and unusable. The very cycle of life, the foundational rhythm of an agrarian society, was brought to an abrupt and terrifying halt. When the last person walked away or simply lay down, what was left? Only the silent testament of their struggle. A single frozen shoe in the snow. A half-eaten meal abandoned on a table. A child's toy, dropped in a hasty retreat that led to nowhere but further cold. These were not relics of a battlefield but the poignant, heartbreaking evidence of a sudden, brutal stop to everyday life, a sudden, brutal end to a civilization that simply ran out of time, out of warmth, out of options. The wind became the only voice, whistling through the skeletal remains of once proud structures. Snow drifted through shattered windows, piling up inside homes, burying memories and dreams under layers of white. The roads became indistinguishable from the fields, the boundaries between human endeavor and untamed wilderness dissolving under a universal cloak of frost. The world was being erased, not by fire but by ice, leaving behind a pristine, deadly canvas where nothing living dared to tread. We find traces, sometimes even now. The layout of a vanished city glimpsed from the air, a faint impression beneath the permafrost. The occasional artifact, perfectly preserved by the cold, whispering of a life abruptly ended. These remnants are not testaments to great conquests, but rather to the chilling power of nature, and the fragility of even the most established human endeavors. They speak of a time when the world simply shrugged off humanity, letting empires crumble into the quiet, unyielding embrace of the snow. The ultimate irony of these kingdoms was their lack of a definitive end point. There was no decisive battle, no surrender treaty, no final speech from a dying king. There was only the slow, inexorable fading, the gentle yet terrifying dissolution into nothingness. One day there were people, striving, living, hoping. The next, there was only the snow, covering everything, silencing everything, leaving only a vast, empty expanse where once complex societies had thrived. And then silence. A profound, absolute silence that stretched across continents, broken only by the whimpering wind. The memory of these empires did not live on in epic poems or heroic sagas, but in the cold, hard fact of their absence, a gaping void in the tapestry of human history. They became a chilling testament to the fact that sometimes, the most devastating force is not overt violence, but the quiet, relentless, beautiful, and utterly merciless indifference of a world consumed by winter. The snow fell, and the empires simply faded, until there was nothing left but the endless, quiet white of winter buried not just the lives, but the very stones that marked their passing. Yet, beneath the relentless shroud of snow and ice, or sometimes, starkly exposed to the indifferent elements, stood the ghostly citadels. These were not mere ruins worn by centuries of slow decay, but frozen monuments to a sudden, absolute cessation of life. Imagine a city, grand and bustling one day, then as if a spell had been cast, utterly petrified the next. Walk with me through the silent avenues of what was once a mighty capital. The wind whispers now where merchants once haggled, where children's laughter echoed, where the heavy gates of power swung open and shut. You see the skeletal remains of what were once soaring towers, their intricate carvings now blurred by frost, their sturdy foundations fractured by the relentless expansion of ice. The very air here feels heavy, thick with the unspoken stories of those who vanished. This is not the slow death of time, but the sudden, violent erasure of an entire world. These citadels, once vibrant hubs of human endeavor, now stand as stark, desolate witnesses to the winter's triumph. Their grand plazas, where thousands gathered for festivals or proclamations, are now vast, empty plains of packed snow, the silence broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind. The imposing walls, built to repel invaders and declare a kingdom's might, now simply hold back the encroaching wilderness, protecting nothing, defending no one. They are silent sentinels watching over an empire of ghosts. Consider the grand palaces, their ornate chambers once filled with the warmth of hearths and the light of countless lamps. Now they are caverns of ice, their ceilings festooned with shimmering stalactites, their floors paved with sheets of frozen crystal. You might stumble upon a frozen tapestry, its vibrant colors muted to a dull tapestry of grays and whites, still clinging to a wall, a silent scream against the oblivion that consumed its creators. Or perhaps, a throne room, its regal seat still perfectly preserved, a chilling testament to the king or queen who must have fled or perished or simply ceased to be, leaving behind their symbol of power as a cold, useless relic. The temples too suffer this chilling fate. Their altars, once ablaze with sacred fires and alive with the fervent prayers of a people seeking divine favor, now lie beneath layers of rime. The statues of gods, carved with such devotion and artistry, stare out with vacant, frozen eyes, impotent before the power that swept away their worshippers. These are not places of worship anymore, but mausoleums for forgotten faith, their sacred spaces transformed into icebound crypts. What does it mean to walk through a city frozen in time, not by volcanic ash, but by the slow, suffocating embrace of a killer winter? It means to confront the brutal finality of existence. You won't find bustling markets here, only the ghost of their memory in the collapsed stalls, the overturned carts, perhaps a handful of frozen coins scattered like forgotten dreams. You won't hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, only the crack of ice as it gives way underfoot, a sound that echoes with the absence of life. The residential districts, once teeming with families, with the mundane miracles of daily life, are perhaps the most haunting. Row upon row of homes, some still standing, others collapsed into indistinguishable mounds of snow and timber. Imagine peering into a window, if the glass has not shattered, and seeing the interior preserved in a moment of hasty departure, or perhaps, in the eternal slumber of those caught unaware. A forgotten toy, a book left open on a table, a cooking pot still on a cold hearth. Each artifact a poignant whisper of lives abruptly ended, hopes unfulfilled, stories unfinished. These are not relics of war, but of a quiet, relentless, elemental disaster. These ghost cities are not just monuments to loss, but to the fragility of human dominion. For centuries, these kingdoms had believed themselves eternal, their architectures solid, their systems unbreakable. They carved their stories into stone, confident that their legacy would endure. Yet, one winter, one single season of extraordinary cold and snow, proved them wrong. The snow, the wind, the ice, they did not distinguish between a peasant's hovel and an emperor's palace. All were equally vulnerable, equally destined to be swallowed by the encroaching white. The true terror of these frozen remains is not their decay, but their preservation. They stand as silent, mocking testaments to human ambition, to the belief that anything could truly last. The very grandeur that once defined them now amplifies their tragedy. The intricate carvings, the soaring arches, the vast open spaces, they once spoke of power, culture, and thriving populations. Now, in their stark, frozen silence, they speak only of absence, of a sudden, inexplicable void. No chronicler recorded the final moments of these cities, no artist sketched their last breath. There are no scrolls detailing the desperate exodus, no sagas recounting the heroic last stands. Only the mute stones remain, covered in their icy shroud, whispering their untold stories to the empty wind. And in these whispers, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the echoes of a civilization that simply vanished, leaving behind only the cold, beautiful, and utterly merciless architecture of its own demise, waiting patiently for a sun that may never thaw its frozen embrace. The very air in these places is a memory, a chilling reminder that the world can turn on you, not with fire and fury, but with a quiet, insidious cold. The snow did not just fall, it entombed. It did not just cover, it swallowed. And what it left behind were these ghostly citadels, frozen in their last moments, eternally awaiting the return of people who will never come. They stand not as warnings from the past, but as a prophecy of what the world can become. A magnificent, frozen monument to the transient nature of all things, built by hands that are now dust for a world that simply forgot to continue. Each crumbling archway, each fractured column, each ice-encrusted plaza holds a silent elegy. It is a lament for the vibrant life that once pulsed within these walls, for the dreams and struggles of countless souls now lost to the annals of an unforgiving history. To gaze upon these frozen remnants is to confront the terrifying fragility of human civilization, to understand that even the most monumental achievements can be reduced to silent, ice-bound specters overnight. The grandeur remains, but only as a tragic echo, a stark reminder of what was and what will never be again. The ghost of every person who lived and breathed in these places lingers, not as a visible spirit, but as an imprint upon the very fabric of the desolate landscape. Their absence is so profound, so palpable, that it becomes a presence in itself. You feel it in the stillness, in the overwhelming quiet that presses down upon you, in the way the light catches the frozen surfaces, revealing not glinting life, but the cold, hard glint of forgotten ages. These are not merely abandoned structures. They are monuments to the great silence, the moment when the world simply ceased to be for these people. The beauty of their architecture, now encased in ice, serves as a cruel counterpoint to the ugliness of their fate. They are the frozen screams of empires, caught forever in the grip of a single devastating winter, their glory transformed into a haunting glacial majesty. Yet, this glacial majesty, this terrible beauty, holds more than just the silent screams of empires. Beneath the polished ice, within the entombed halls, lie the true whispers of what was. You must imagine the audacity, the sheer, almost insane courage required to step past the visible horror, to brave the perpetual twilight of these frozen ruins. What drives a soul to seek answers where only silence reigns? Perhaps it is the insatiable human need to understand, to witness, to touch the remnants of a life that once pulsed with warmth and purpose. It is a journey not for the faint of heart, for every step is a trespass into a tomb of unimaginable scale. Each breath you take in this frigid air feels borrowed, an affront to the absolute stillness that has claimed this land for centuries. Imagine yourself then, a solitary figure dwarfed by colossal frozen facades, the biting air stealing your breath with each gasp. Your lamp carves a trembling path through the eternal gloom, revealing not grandeur, but a deeper, more intimate desolation. You are not just exploring ruins. You are a ghost in a ghost city, walking where feet once trod with certainty, where voices once sang, where laughter once echoed. But now, only the crunch of your boots on packed snow and the urgent thrum of your own beating heart break the monumental hush. The very air feels heavy, saturated with unspoken goodbyes, with the last desperate exhales of a civilization caught unaware. Each frozen artifact, each sliver of icebound memory, becomes a testament, a final declaration from a people lost to time, their final moments stretched into an agonizing eternity by the relentless cold. You push deeper, driven by an unseen force, a compulsion to bear witness to what was. And then you find them. Not the grand monuments that first drew your eye, but the fragile fragments of everyday existence, rendered eternal by the unforgiving cold. Here in what was once a bustling marketplace, a merchant's scales lie overturned, a few coins scattered like fallen tears across the icy ground, reflecting the dim light with a dull, indifferent sheen. The last transaction interrupted, frozen in time, its purpose lost to the ages. What hopes did that merchant hold for the day? What small dreams did those coins represent? Perhaps a meal for a child, a new tool for their trade. A child's wooden doll, perfectly preserved, rests cradled in a drift of snow in a doorway, its painted eyes wide with a permanent, silent wonder. Did the little one simply drop it, intending to retrieve it later, their small fingers numbed by a sudden, brutal chill? Did a parent clutch it close in a final, futile gesture of comfort, before the end swallowed them whole? The questions pile upon you, heavy as the ice above, each unanswered whisper a new layer of sorrow, a weight that presses down on your very spirit. In what must have been a home, the remnants of a hearth still stand, a blackened pot suspended above a pile of charcoal that never had a chance to fully ignite. A half-eaten meal on a table, preserved as if waiting for its diners to return from an errand that would never be completed. A simple, wholesome repast now a monument to sudden absence. You can almost feel the phantom warmth that once emanated from this spot, a cruel counterpoint to the brutal cold that now consumes everything. A mother's needlework, a tapestry half finished, its vibrant threads now muted by the chill, still threaded on the needle, a task abruptly abandoned. You trace the patterns with your gloved finger, imagining her hands, her thoughts, her quiet industry, utterly unaware of the catastrophe lurking just beyond her window, waiting to seize her world. These are not mere objects. They are the petrified echoes of human hands, human minds, human hearts, each one a stark reminder of the lives that ceased so abruptly, so unfairly. The horror sharpens with each discovery, transitioning from silent awe to a profound empathy for their struggle. You see the signs of hurried flight, of desperate attempts to barricade against an unseen enemy that was not an army, but the very air itself. Doors ripped from their hinges not by invaders, but by the relentless press of accumulating snow, trapping them within their own homes, or perhaps sealing their fate outside. Windows shattered not by stones, but by the expansion of water freezing within their panes, allowing the deadly cold to seep in without mercy. You envision families huddled together, their breath clouding in the rapidly falling temperatures, watching their world turn white, then gray, then utterly silent, the light itself seeming to diminish with each passing hour. The fear, the dawning comprehension of an unstoppable doom, must have been a physical weight, pressing down harder than any falling ice, crushing their spirits long before their bodies succumbed. You find bodies, sometimes not skeletal remains, but figures frozen in the attitudes of their final moments, perfectly preserved by the cold. A father shielding his child, a mother embracing her newborn, a solitary figure collapsed against a wall, perhaps whispering a last prayer. Their faces, though pale and still, bear the indelible imprints of shock, of resignation, of a fierce, desperate love that defied the approaching end. It is a sight that sears itself into your memory, a testament to the raw, visceral human struggle against an insurmountable force. Their last breaths, expelled into an atmosphere that swiftly extinguished life, now seem to hang in the air around you, a chill more profound than any temperature gauge could measure. You try to imagine their last moments, the quiet prayers, the desperate embraces, the realization that the morning would never come for them, that the sun had set on their entire world. Each relic you uncover pulls you deeper into their story, into their final agonizing hours, the narrative of their disappearance unfolding before your very eyes, not through words, but through the poignant stillness of their remains. The chill in the air is no longer just physical. It permeates your very soul, leaving an ache that resonates with the echoes of their suffering. You feel the crushing loneliness of their end, the profound injustice of a world stolen by a single merciless season, a winter that devoured kingdoms whole. This is not history read from a book. This is history felt in the marrow of your bones, a direct communion with the lost, a tangible touch across the chasm of centuries. You are not an observer. You become a keeper of their final moments, an accidental archivist of their silenced cries. The weight of their memory, individually and collectively, settles upon you, a mantle of sorrow woven from the threads of countless unlived futures, of generations that never had the chance to be. Why brave such a desolate world? Why awaken these sleeping ghosts, disturbing their eternal slumber? Because within these frozen echoes lies more than just tragedy. There is a testament to human resilience, to the quiet dignity of a people who lived and loved and built, even in the shadow of an unknown fate. Their memory, preserved by the very force that extinguished them, serves as a poignant reminder of our own fragile existence, of the thin veil that separates our vibrant present from a potential future of utter stillness. To unearth these lost memories is to give voice to the voiceless, to honor the forgotten, to acknowledge that even in the most catastrophic silence, the human spirit, however briefly, left its indelible mark upon the world. It is a promise to remember, etched not in stone, but in the enduring, unforgiving ice, a promise whispered across the ages, a solemn vow to never let their story truly die, even if their world did. The world of these vanished kingdoms may have died, but its echo, distorted and profound, resonated through the ages. It seeped into the collective unconscious of nascent civilizations that rose in the wake of the Great Freeze, becoming the genesis of their darkest fears and most enduring myths. Imagine the campfire tales, whispered in the nascent glow, long before written history, stories of an older time when the sun itself seemed to betray humanity, when the very breath of the world turned to frozen daggers. These were not just quaint fables. They were the genetic memory of a planet scarred by unimaginable cold, a primal scream passed down through generations. Across vastly separated cultures, threads of a shared catastrophe appeared. The legend spoke of a great winter, a time when the sky wept snow for years unending, when the rivers ceased their flow and became solid, unyielding highways of ice. They told of cities swallowed whole by snowdrifts taller than any temple, of entire peoples simply vanishing, leaving behind only an unbearable silence and the chilling whisper of the wind. In some cultures, this cataclysm became the act of vengeful gods, a divine punishment for human hubris, a frozen apocalypse brought forth by offended deities of winter and frost. The Norse sagas, centuries later, would speak of Fimbulwinter, a 3-year winter preceding Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Was this a mere coincidence, a shared cultural archetype? Or was it a distant, mutated memory of an actual devastating global winter, the ghost of a truly lost age woven into the very fabric of their cosmology? The sheer scale of destruction, the utter finality of it, lent itself perfectly to divine intervention, to the dramatic canvas of myth-making. For how else could mortal minds comprehend such an absolute world-ending event, if not as the wrath of the heavens? Other legends spoke of brave heroes who battled primordial ice beasts, of shamans who tried in vain to bargain with the encroaching frost, of entire tribes journeying south, desperate, relentless, only to vanish into the relentless white. These were not tales of dragons or giants in the abstract. They were echoes of a very real struggle, the human spirit pitted against an inhuman, indifferent force. They were testaments to the impossible choices faced by those who lived through the initial onslaught, the harrowing journeys, the slow, agonizing surrender to the inevitable. The myths were not simply entertaining stories. They were survival guides, encoded warnings, a desperate attempt to imprint the lessons of an unimaginable past onto the consciousness of a fragile future. Remember this, they seem to scream across the millennia, for it can happen again. The memory of the kingdoms lost to that singular, devastating winter became a shadow haunting the fringes of human understanding. It instilled a deep-seated respect, perhaps even a terror, of the elements, a profound awareness of humanity's precarious place in the grand scheme of the natural world. Civilizations that rose from the ashes of that epoch, unknowingly built upon the frozen graves of their predecessors, carried this inherited caution. They learned to read the sky, to interpret the subtle shifts in wind and weather, to build with resilience against the possibility, however remote, of another long, unending night. But as centuries stretched into millennia, the stark reality of that winter faded. The memory softened, became allegory, then pure myth. The chilling details of human suffering were replaced by grander narratives, by the struggle of gods and monsters. The specificity of the disaster became generalized, a backdrop for epic tales rather than a precise historical warning. And with that softening, a dangerous complacency began to creep in. The raw terror of a world plunged into an instant ice age became a distant fable, a story told to frighten children, devoid of its urgent existential truth. Yet, in our modern age, as the ice itself begins to speak through melting glaciers and shifting climate patterns, these ancient myths take on a terrifying new resonance. The stories of kingdoms vanishing beneath a blanket of snow, of sudden, cataclysmic shifts in the global climate, no longer feel like distant fantasies. They feel like direct, urgent warnings from a forgotten past. Consider the science. The concept of abrupt climate change, once relegated to the fringes of climatology, has moved firmly into mainstream discourse. We speak now not of gradual warming over centuries, but of tipping points, of feedback loops, of sudden dramatic shifts that could fundamentally alter our planet's habitability within decades or even years. The very idea that a single devastating winter could wipe out entire civilizations, once deemed hyperbolic, now feels chillingly plausible. The mechanisms may differ. We do not face an ancient comet impact or a supervolcano eruption that darkens the sun for years. Instead, we face the cumulative impact of our own relentless progress, our insatiable consumption, our disregard for the delicate balance of Earth's systems. But the outcome, if unchecked, could be terrifyingly similar. A rapid, brutal transformation of the world as we know it, a challenge to which our current societies may prove as vulnerable as those forgotten kingdoms of old. The disappearance of those kingdoms serves as a stark, uncompromising mirror held up to our own reflection. Their failure, their demise, was not a moral failing in the way many myths depicted it. It was a failure to adapt to an unprecedented, unforgiving environmental cataclysm. It was a testament to the immense power of nature, and the ultimate fragility of even the most sophisticated human endeavors when faced with forces beyond their control. What lessons do they impart, these ghosts of a frozen age? They whisper of the interconnectedness of all life, of the delicate balance that sustains us. They speak of the perils of ignoring the subtle signs, the slow accumulation of danger that can suddenly, without warning, accelerate into catastrophe. They remind us that our technology, our societal structures, our economic systems, are all built upon the foundational stability of the planet. Disrupt that foundation and everything we hold dear becomes precarious. Perhaps their greatest warning is one of humility. We stand today at the apex of technological achievement, with the capacity to reshape our world, to communicate across continents, to unlock the very secrets of life. Yet, for all our advancements, we remain intrinsically linked to the planet's rhythms, utterly dependent on its benevolence. The hubris that led ancient civilizations to believe themselves immune to nature's whims is a hubris we risk repeating on a global scale. We may not fear an ice giant, but we should fear the thawing of the permafrost, the collapse of ice sheets, the acidification of oceans, the rapid and unpredictable shifts in global weather patterns. The story of the kingdoms lost to one winter is not just a tragic tale of the past. It is a prophetic vision for the future, a chilling premonition whispered across the vast expanse of time. The ice, in its melting, releases not just ancient bacteria or lost artifacts, but also the memory of a world irrevocably altered, a civilization undone by the sudden, brutal hand of environmental change. We look back at them not just with archaeological curiosity, but with a profound, almost visceral sense of recognition. Their struggle is our struggle. Their vulnerability is our vulnerability. The questions they faced about survival, about adaptation, about the very continuation of their species, are the same questions that loom large on our horizon today. The ice preserves their silent agony, their desperate courage. It holds the key to understanding not just who they were, but who we might become if we fail to heed the profound and urgent warnings etched into the very core of their frozen legacy. Their world died once. The question now is whether we will learn from their silent testament, or allow history and the relentless, unforgiving forces of nature to repeat themselves. The myths of the Great Winter are no longer just stories. They are blueprints of a possible future, stark reminders that the earth itself holds the power to humble, to erase, to redefine the very meaning of human existence, all within the span of a single devastating season. And redefine it did. When the crushing weight of that singular, devastating winter finally began its slow, reluctant retreat, what emerged was a world scarred beyond recognition. It was not merely a landscape altered by ice and wind, but a tapestry of human history torn asunder, whole civilizations erased as if they had never been. The very memory of countless peoples, their triumphs, their sorrows, their intricate daily lives, was swallowed by the relentless white, leaving behind nothing but a gaping, echoing void. Imagine, if you will, the first fragile warmth touching the frostbitten lands. Imagine the slow, agonizing melt, not of ice from a glass, but of millennia of accumulated snow and glacier. And with it, the dawning, horrifying realization. Where once stood bustling cities, their stone temples reaching for the sky, their markets vibrant with the cacophony of commerce and human interaction, there was now only a barren, silent expanse. Where once empires stretched their dominion across vast territories, their banners waving proudly in the seasonal winds, there was now only an untamed wilderness, indifferent and vast. These were not civilizations that faded over centuries, eroded by internal strife or gradual environmental shifts. These were kingdoms, cultures, and entire ways of life extinguished in the span of a single brutal season. One autumn gave way to a winter so profound, so utterly without mercy, that the spring which followed found only ghosts where vibrant life once throbbed. This was the true chilling legacy of the great winter. Not merely hardship and struggle, but absolute annihilation. Think of the high kings of the sun-kissed valleys, their palaces carved from luminous rock, their wisdom chronicled in scrolls woven from desert grasses. One moment their astronomers charted the cosmos, their priests invoked ancient spirits, their artisans crafted jewels of breathtaking beauty. The next their world was consumed. The chill descended with a speed and ferocity that left no time for escape, no opportunity for adaptation. The sun itself seemed to abandon them, its warmth a distant, mocking memory. Lakes froze solid to their depths, rivers became unyielding conduits of ice. The land itself became an enemy, no longer yielding sustenance but an endless, frozen tomb. You might envision the last desperate days. The fires dwindling, the stores depleting, the terrible, gnawing hunger in every belly. The huddle of families, sharing the last embers of hope, their breath pluming white in the deepening cold. The slow, silent surrender of body to an unyielding world. It was not a battle they could fight with swords or shields. It was a siege laid by nature itself, a siege that starved the very air from their lungs, that froze the blood in their veins. The stories tell of sudden blizzards that buried entire towns in days, of ice storms that shattered structures built to withstand generations. But the true horror lay in the insidious creep, the gradual, unceasing intensification of the cold, day after day, week after week, month after month. Hope itself would have frozen, crystallizing into a brittle despair. Communication would have ceased, roads buried, messages never delivered. Each community, each isolated family, faced its own end in terrifying solitude, cut off from the warmth of human connection, from the very notion of a larger world beyond their immediate, shrinking horizon. What knowledge perished in that ice-locked silence? What intricate systems of governance, what profound philosophies, what unique artistic expressions were forever silenced? Imagine the libraries, their precious texts turned to brittle, frozen sheets, then crumbling to dust with the eventual thaw. Imagine the songs, sung for generations around hearths now cold, their melodies lost to the wind. Imagine the unique languages, the very sounds of human communication, vanishing from the world's lexicon, leaving not a single echo. These were not just cities and kingdoms, these were entire universes of human experience, each one a tapestry woven with threads of love, ambition, faith, and innovation. And each one was ripped from existence with brutal finality. The thaw did not reveal these lost worlds intact. It revealed fragments, a broken shard of pottery hinting at an exquisite design, a petrified timber marking where a grand hall once stood, a single bone, a silent testament to a life lived and ended. These were not discoveries to celebrate, but rather stark reminders of the magnitude of loss. When the ice finally relented, giving way to barren earth or newly carved rivers, it did not offer a second chance. It merely exposed the emptiness. The very soil seemed to hold a memory of absent things. The wind whispered through empty valleys where once the laughter of children and the murmur of conversation had filled the air. This was the profound tragedy of the forever lost kingdoms. They did not simply die, they were unmade. Their existence was not just ended, but practically erased from the annals of time. There are no survivors to tell their tales, no descendants to carry on their traditions. Their legacies are not woven into the fabric of our present world, but remain buried deep beneath the earth, beneath the accumulated dust of forgotten epochs. Their history is not a continuous line that we can trace, but a gaping chasm, an interruption in the grand narrative of humanity. We can only speculate, piece together tantalizing clues, and stand in awe of the sheer, terrifying power of the forces that wrought such an absolute end. The remnants found, often by chance, are not treasures in the traditional sense. They are grief-stricken whispers from a past that can never be fully recovered. A perfectly preserved tool, a delicate ornament, a strange, beautiful carving, each artifact a poignant reminder of a skill, an aesthetic, a belief system that disappeared utterly. You pick up a polished stone and hold a connection to a hand that shaped it, a mind that conceived it, a culture that valued it. And then you remember that the hand, the mind, the culture, are gone. Forever. This is the true terror of the great winter, beyond the immediate suffering. It is the obliteration of memory, the finality of total cultural erasure. It is the realization that entire branches of the human story tree were not merely pruned, but severed at the root, leaving no opportunity for new growth. We are left with a fundamental lack, a knowledge gap so vast that it humbles our every attempt to fully understand our own origins. Consider the implications. Every language, every artistic style, every unique form of societal organization that vanished in that winter represents a lost path for human development. A different way of seeing the world, a different solution to life's challenges, a different expression of the human spirit. All gone. The richness and diversity of human civilization, once blossoming across the globe, was dramatically pruned, leaving a diminished garden, albeit one that eventually recovered. But what was lost was truly lost. The thaw, when it came, was not a rebirth for these civilizations, but a slow revelation of their absolute demise. It was the unveiling of a crime scene, vast and ancient, where the victims were not individuals but entire peoples. The ice had preserved them for a time, a chilling, indifferent vault. But upon its retreat, it offered no resurrection, only the stark evidence of what could not be brought back. The exposed ruins, the scattered bones, the silent fields where once cities stood, were monuments not to endurance but to finality. The absence of these kingdoms, their utter silence, is perhaps the loudest message of all. It tells us that even the grandest monuments, the deepest wisdom, the most vibrant cultures, are but fleeting shadows against the backdrop of an indifferent universe. Their forgotten legacy is not a treasure map to be followed, but a chilling epitaph, a testament to the fact that some winters leave behind only an unfillable void. And in that void, a terrifying question echoes: what truly secures our place in the long story of this world?